And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Thanks for being with us here on your Friday night. Hope you're getting a good start to your weekend. I know so many of you over the last 3.5+ years have been following each and every turn in the war in Ukraine as they continue to fend off Russian aggression with the United States' help here. Earlier this week in Rome, there was a summit talking about Ukraine's future and how they are going to rebuild. Our special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, was there. He met with Volodymyr Zelensky. This coming as well, as President Trump said in an interview on the phone with NBC News yesterday, that he's going to be making a major statement on Russia on Monday. This as the United States is selling weapons to its NATO allies in Europe so they can provide them to Ukraine as it struggles to fend off a recent escalation in Russia's drone and missile attacks. Trump saying this in that interview with NBC News: "We're sending weapons to NATO, and NATO is paying for those weapons 100%. Let's bring into the conversation now national security analyst and expert and retired Marine intelligence officer Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, good to be with you, and happy Friday here. It's been a busy week on the international front. Wanted to ask you this. How customary is this that the United States sells weapons to the NATO alliance for NATO members in the very alliance to use for another country's war that it's fighting?
You know, Andrew, it does seem a little odd, although I heard discussions of something very similar to this going back quite some time. The idea of using the profits from the seized assets or frozen assets that the Russians have been used to pay for buying arms for Ukraine for quite some time. There was talk at one time that maybe those assets could be liquidated and that could be used to pay for arms for Ukraine. And at that time, the idea was that the U.S. would take lead and the preponderance of that money would go to the U.S. to provide arms to Ukraine. So this is kind of in that same theme. The idea is that the U.S. isn't just giving arms away to Ukraine, but it's actually selling them. Of course, with that said, a Senate committee that actually approves sending arms to Ukraine just approved with an amazing, I think it was like 28-1 vote in favor of a $500 million going to Ukraine as a basically that is a gift, if you will. I don't know how you want to describe it, but that is aid from the U.S. direct. So there still is a lot of political support within Congress for that. But this is something that's been kind of kicked around for a bit. At first I looked at it, I scratched my head. I go, why are we doing this? Is this parsing hairs? Is this trying to somehow, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking this, is this somehow appeasing the Russians in some way, that we're not sending aid directly to the Russians? And I really think what it is, and if you get into certainly Donald Trump's rhetoric and stuff, is he thinks like a businessman. And he's looking, we got the arms, they need the arms. Let's just find a way to get them over there. And he's looking at NATO nations as an intermediary.
Okay, I want to talk about intermediaries. On the flip side of that, maybe Trump is thinking, we talk about whether or not he's operating on 3D, 4D, or 5D chess, that if we sell the United States weapons to NATO and NATO gives them to Ukraine, that's not just a second-order tier, that's a third-order tier, third degree removed from the United States, the weapons that we make, we provide, being used against Russian soldiers. Do you think that's part of the calculation?
It's part of the calculation, but I will say it's not a unique thing.
Okay.
I know it sounds kind of odd because of the way it's been phrased, but I've seen this within Europe. They have been doing this. A number of nations have some unusual laws about that. So they have been selling arms to one country, and then that country does something, and then they send that to another country, and somehow it makes its way into Ukraine. So there is a pattern here. There's something that's been established that's within Europe. We haven't done this, although I have heard that some arms have come out of Asia that have moved through NATO countries to get over to Ukraine.
Interesting.
Because those countries couldn't send them direct. And so this isn't a brand new concept. I think really what it is, though, is that Donald Trump wants to make sure that we're getting paid for the aid. That's something he campaigned on. Basically, he's called at times NATO freeloaders, if you will, and stuff like that. Well, what he's trying to say is, look, this is in Europe, this is NATO, and NATO needs to put up money for this. And within NATO, there are countries that have a really large chunk of that those frozen Russian assets.
Right.
So there is a way within NATO to make money move to pay for this stuff.
All right. Hal, let's talk, though, about somewhat of the efficiency of this. According to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, he says it's a lot faster to move something, for example, from Germany to Ukraine than it is to order it from a U.S. factory and get it there. Logistically speaking, this makes sense, does it not?
Well, okay. Theoretically,
okay.
yes.
You disagree? You disagree with the Secretary of State there?
I'm not going to say I disagree with him, but yes, if something's in Europe, if something's in Germany and you move it to Ukraine, it's a lot faster. However, if it's U.S. arms, they've got to get to Germany first. So it depends on where the origination point is of the arms in that regard. Although with that said, there's stuff that we could replenish war stocks that we have in Germany and then use some of the war stocks that we're rotating out and move those over to Ukraine. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the things we had a lot of are the 113 armored vehicles. We don't really use 113s. Those are old vehicles. That's really goes back to Vietnam War time frame. However, they have been very utilitarian for the Ukrainians in moving forces to and from the front lines. They provide a degree of protection. Not great for battlefield where there's a lot of anti-tank missiles and stuff flying around, but for rear area stuff, they've been very useful. So they've been able to make those useful. That's something that we have that you would probably find in war stocks, either in the U.S. or over in Europe.
Okay.
That's something that could be brought down, depreciated, moved out and sent over to Ukraine, and we could replenish those with armored vehicles that we actually use.
Okay. Hal, lastly, though, you're talking about the types of weapons. Let's focus, lastly, our efforts on this type of weapon, the Patriot system there. That Ukraine has been asking for more of. Is it going to be in this latest tranche?
It does sound that way. It's interesting. Patriots, it sound like some of the Patriot missiles, and it sound like HIMARS are going to be going in that. In fact, there was a number of high-end systems, which are certainly stuff that we need for our war stocks. We need to build up a lot more. There's a report that came out last week that said if there's a big war with China, for example, our near-peer competitor, and with all the other commitments, we got about 25% of the Patriot systems we need. So certainly we have a big demand on that, but it does sound like those air defense systems are going in. That's what Ukraine's been asking for. That's what the Europeans have been saying. Hey, look, U.S., you've got to get more of these things in there.
Yeah.
And also, you have to remember, a lot of those things that were supposed to go to Ukraine got diverted over to Israel. And so there is a deficit of those air defense weapons, those air defense missiles in Ukraine. So they have to kind of fill that gap. And you've seen what the Russians are doing.
Yeah.
They're saying these massive waves of missiles and drones taking advantage of this, lowered readiness position with air defense that Kyiv and other key Ukrainian cities have right now.
All right, Hal Kempfer, we're going to have to leave it at that. Hal, thanks so much for your help and helping us make sense of these stories throughout the course of the week. Have a good weekend.
All right, you too, Andrew.
Okay, in the meantime here, in lieu of going to another commercial,